Christian parenting.
Aloha, friends! Welcome to the Boy Mom Podcast, powered by Christian Parenting and hosted by my mom, Monica Swanson. On the Boy Mom Podcast, it is our goal to provide you with practical advice and biblical wisdom for raising boys in this sometimes crazy world. You can find show notes for the podcast over at monicaswanson.com/podcast. We're so glad you're here.
We want to communicate to kids that feelings are just feelings, and we're going to have a range of them. And for some kids, for some boys, they have big emotions, like they feel deeply.
Yes.
And that's a fantastic thing. You know, I tend to say to a lot of those boys who are like, what's wrong with me? I just get so mad or I get so sad. I'm like, buddy, there's nothing wrong with you. That's how God hardwired you. And I'll tell you what I call that. I call that husband material. Your wife is going to love that on you.
Yes. Aloha, friends. Well, that little clip was from David Thomas. And oh my goodness, I am so excited to share this episode with you. And not just this episode, but we have another one, kind of a part 2, coming up in 2 weeks because there was just way too much to cover for one podcast episode. And the truth is, I'm already trying to plan to get him back for a 3rd and 4th episode because this guy's just got so much good stuff for boy moms. If you are not following David Thomas yet, I think by the end of this conversation today, you will want to be. Now, I was pulling out some of the books I've read over the years written by David Thomas related to raising boys. He's got a number of them. I'm going to link to them in the show notes. And also, I've been catching up on his podcast, which we're going to talk about and also link to in the show notes. And it just occurred to me that this is somebody that has such a heart for boys, for families. He will be familiar to you because he works alongside Sissy Goff, who was here on episode 72, talking about kids and anxiety, kids who worry, especially during this pandemic. And the two of them work together at Daystar Counseling Ministry in Tennessee, and they've also written a number of books together. And today we are drawing from the book they wrote called Are My Kids on Track? The 12 Emotional, Social, and Spiritual Milestones Your Child Needs to Reach. So today we are going to cover 4 emotional milestones as well as some of the stumbling blocks to be looking out for as your kids reach those milestones. And then in 2 weeks, he's going to be back to talk about the social milestones you want to see your sons reaching and some of the stumbling blocks there. I definitely want to have him back to talk about spiritual milestones and a bunch of other things that he is just so wise and experienced in talking about. Again, I think you're going to love his heart, so I don't need to say much more. Now, before we jump in, I want to thank you again for all of your support. It has been a crazy busy fall, and you guys have been so awesome. I hope many of you were a part of the Perfectly Imperfect Christian Parenting event. I hope you loved it. And remember, you have to the end of 2020 to catch all those speakers. So take your time. It was so much fun to be a part of that event. And I just appreciate this community so much. One thing I haven't mentioned in a while is that I have an awesome online community of folks that I email once a week. And if you're not on that list yet, I would love for you to get on that list. Now, if you're like me, you might be thinking, nobody wants more emails. Our inboxes are all full. I get that. But I really work hard to craft an email every week that is short and sweet, but packed with everything you would want to know. This is where I put the latest podcast episodes or blog posts. Sometimes I'll share a great article I've come across or even a recipe I've tried. This is where I share kind of any inside news, something going on with my family, or if I need feedback on a project, it's where I'm going to share big updates first. So if you want to be a part of that kind of inside crew, these are my people. I would love to have you go straight over to monicaswanson.com/subscribe. Leave your name and email address. I don't think you'll regret it. I have people tell me it's the highlight of their week every Tuesday getting that email. I really try to bring a smile to your faces and offer some encouragement. So I hope you'll become a part of that online community. Okay, guys, without further ado, I'm so excited to share this episode with you as David Thomas and I talk about emotional milestones we want our sons to meet. I hope you're encouraged, and I'll have a few final words to say at the end. David, welcome to the Boy Mom Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this time.
Well, I'm super excited to have you on, and I have read many of your books. We've already had Sissy Goff, who you work closely with and write with, here on the podcast. And the more I read what you write, the more I listen to your podcast, I'm just like, I just want to point everyone to you. So before we jump in, because I'm so excited about today's topic, could you just introduce yourself, your family, and your work?
I'd love to, but I want to first say those are incredibly kind words, and I feel the exact same. Sissy, so enjoyed conversations with you, and I can't tell you, as somebody who works with boys and families and has written a lot around that content, just how much I believe in the relationship between boys and moms, and believe there is so much to that relationship. So I'm incredibly grateful for the work you're doing too, and just again really honored to be a part of today.
Thank you.
And absolutely. And I am a therapist. I work with children, adolescents, and families, and have done this work at this amazing place called Daystar Counseling for almost 25 years now. And we serve just the pediatric population. And we do the work in a really different way in that we're in a house rather than an office complex. And the most sought after therapists in our practice are actually dogs. We have 5 therapy dogs on staff.
I love it.
And I'm convinced there are a lot of kids who really aren't sure what our names are, but they know all the dogs. So we're all trying to get in line behind them.
I can imagine.
Absolutely. I work with a great team of folks, and just really grateful to get to do this meaningful, life-giving work with these amazing people, and that I've been able to do that for quite some time now. And in addition to the kids I have the privilege of working with, I have 3 of my own. I've been married to an amazing woman for the last 25 years, and we have a daughter. And then about a year into her life, we got pregnant for the second time, and we were incredibly grateful to be pregnant again. And we went midway through the pregnancy for our ultrasound, as you do, and said to the technician on the way in, okay, what you need to know about us is that we're really old school. We don't want to know what we're having. We didn't know my daughter was a girl till the day she was born. So make a note, but we'd like to be surprised. And she agreed. And I can still remember where I was standing in the room when she looked up with this huge smile and said, I see 2 heads. And I remember thinking, why are you smiling if the baby has 2 heads? Like, nothing about that sounded right to me. We were genuinely that shocked. Like, we have no history of multiples in our family.
Whoa.
My wife had not gained extra weight. Her counts weren't different. None of the indicators that you get when you're carrying multiples were there for us. So here we are, midway through this pregnancy, finding out that multiples, almost always come early. And so I'm like, well, clearly we're so behind at this point. You go ahead and tell us what we're having. But wait, I'm going to lay down on the floor while you do it. And she said 2 boys. And so we are still, we're still recovering from that news 18 years later.
Oh, I cannot imagine raising twins. And so they are 18 now. Is that right?
They are seniors in high school. So we're right on the edge of becoming empty nesters. We've launched one out in the world, and I think you've done the same. Am I correct?
Yes. I've launched 2, but we kind of spread ours out. So I've got a couple more years to keep these little guys around.
It's a whole new season, isn't it?
Oh, it is. I don't know how to feel about it. I might need therapy, but
well, we'll talk together.
Yes. Well, I love that story so much, and God bless you and your wife for raising twins. And I have a friend actually who's going to be on the podcast pretty soon who has triplet boys. So I can't wait for that conversation.
I would just kneel in her presence.
Exactly.
That's
and
heroic.
Hers all just launched too. So can you imagine sending 3 at once to college?
No.
Well, as I wrote my book, Boy Mom, I was certainly deep into reading many of your books. You talk about kids, you talk about boys. And I have just loved your perspective. I just feel like I resonate with pretty much everything I read from you. And I know that you and Sissy together, actually, it's kind of a crew of you, have the podcast Raising Boys and Girls.
Yes.
But somehow I just recently discovered that you also have a podcast, not too many episodes, but a few episodes. And that podcast is called All About Boys, right?
It is. I was invited by Rooted Ministries to do a season all about boys, and it has been just a real privilege to be able to devote a whole season to just talking about all the different aspects of a boy's life and his different relationships. We've talked about boys and moms, boys and dads, boys and emotions. I have a
Mhm.
episode coming out on boys and friendship soon. But yeah, I've been really
Mm.
grateful to have that space to talk about boys as well.
Yeah, I will just tell everyone, I think if you listen to my podcast, if you enjoy talking about raising boys, this is one that is a must listen. So I think you could pretty well do it. I've done this last week and just go binge listen to all those episodes. I am just really a big fan. And also, we're going to be linking to those as well as to your books in the show notes. So everyone can definitely go to show notes and find links to all of that. But today we are going to do the first of a two-part series because I'm just too eager to talk about all these things. And I want to tackle the topic of boys and emotional milestones. This is something I found so fascinating to listen to you talk about. So would you open this up and just begin to lead us through? And in fact, before we hit the emotional milestones, you talk about stages of a boy's life, right? Can you break those
Yes.
down for us just so we have that framework?
I'd be happy to. And I'm always quick to say when I talk about the stages of development that these aren't the only stages or even the right stages. They're just stages that for me make the most sense when I
Mm-hmm.
think about boy development in ways that I hope are helpful for parents in thinking about these pockets of development that boys are in. So these
Sure.
are the 5 ways I break down boy development. And I start with the what I call the explorer, and that's basically boys birth through 4.
Okay.
And then I moved to what I call the lover stage, which is boys 5 to 8. And I'm on record as saying, Monica, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this or not, but if I could freeze a boy in his development,
Mm-hmm.
I would freeze him
Yeah.
in the lover stage.
Mm-hmm.
Like I
Yes.
think boys are full of some of their best stuff in that
Mm-hmm.
moment of development.
Mm-hmm.
Plenty of amazing things happening in different moments, but there is a lot that's happening in that moment that is just
Yeah.
remarkable. So
Yes.
that's the lover stage. And then boys move into the individual stage. That's 9 to 12. And that's that window of pre-adolescence. That's a really pivotal point in his development, and particularly in terms of his identity formation.
Mm.
And then he moves deep into mid and late adolescence in what I call the wanderer stage. And that's 13 to 17. And that's a pocket of development that most every developmental theorist would say is the most complicated moment of a boy's life, which I think can become, not always, but can become one of the more complicated moments of parenting him, which is, you know, a great reason right there why I believe so strongly in studying development, because the more we understand about what's going on with him uniquely in that moment, the better we can support him,
Yeah.
the better I think we can transition in our relationship with him in that season. And so that's a really important season as well. And then he moves into what might be my second favorite stage, and that's called the warrior stage. And that's young, 18 and 22. And I love what happens for
Yeah.
boys in that stretch of development. And it
Yes.
makes me so excited. I don't get to talk about that stage as often, but I get excited when I do, because I think for parents who are struggling in the wanderer stage and that late adolescence, I just keep shouting, like, there's good stuff coming. There's great stuff
There
coming.
is.
Like, hold
There
on. You're
is.
living it. You're parenting
Yes.
boys in the
With
wanderer stage.
yeah, my 19 and 21-year-old, I am just loving so much this season and our relationship in this season. But I will say, from friendships I have and observing other families, it's an important stage. I think boys are making a lot of
Agree.
big decisions in that time. And so that's one that I've encouraged friends to not step away too much and just say, all right, I've done my work, but to
Yes.
stay involved. I mean, here I am trying to give. Anyways, I just love it, but I'm like, they still need us.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They absolutely do. In fact,
Yeah.
I talk about in that stage that, most every developmental theorist would also agree that boys don't finish adolescence until somewhere between 22 and 25. And
Yeah.
that's significant to lean
Yes.
into, because
Yes.
for girls, it's more 19 to 20. And it just speaks to your point of they're not done developing. They're not done parenting. It just has to look
Right.
different, but there's still
Right.
a strong need for support in that season.
Yeah. And is that a brain thing? Is that why boys are different from girls?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
absolutely.
I love all that. Okay, so now let's dive into some emotional milestones and some of the stumbling blocks and ways we can help our boys through these different milestones.
I'd love to. And I want to just tell you again how grateful I am that you give me a chance to talk about this, because in all the years I've been doing the work I've been doing, I don't think I have ever felt as concerned about some things as I have in the last 5 years. And it was one of the reasons this book felt really important for us to write, because we basically, in the front side of the book, just define what are these milestones. And then we go deep into what does it look like to help kids move toward these, because more than ever, we're seeing evidence in our practice. And I think the national statistics reflect this, that kids just aren't progressing toward these really important emotional, social, and spiritual milestones.
Totally.
And I think it explains so much of what we're seeing in our world. So I'm just grateful anytime that I get an opportunity to talk about it. And the 4 emotional milestones, I'll define those, and then we can talk about some of the stumbling blocks and building blocks. The first is the milestone of vocabulary, and that is just developing a true emotional vocabulary. And here's a great example of the statement I just made a few minutes ago. Now more than ever, I'm hearing kids use these big, strong, exaggerated words to describe their experience, because I don't think they have an emotional vocabulary. So rarely anymore do I hear kids say, I felt sad about that happening. They say, I feel depressed. They don't say, I feel worried. They say, I have anxiety. When I was growing up, if you felt really frustrated and wanted to make sure your parents knew, I might have even thrown out a declaration like, I'm going to run away from home.
Totally.
And I even packed a duffel bag one time and made it about halfway down the street and got scared and came back. But Monica, I haven't heard in the last 10 years a kid say, I'm going to run away from home, or a parent report hearing that. And now what they say is, I'm going to kill myself. And they're using these bigger words, these bigger declarations, because I don't think they have a true emotional vocabulary where they can anchor themselves accurately to what they're experiencing.
That is so interesting to me.
Yes.
Okay.
It is. And the second is the milestone of perspective. And perspective is learning to categorize all the events of life accurately. So it's figuring out on a 1 to 10 scale that a 1 is losing my car keys and a 10 is losing a family member. But more than ever, we are seeing kids slam up against 10. They're living in the 8 to 10 space over insignificant events. Like it's daily that I will hear a parent in my office say, I told him to hand me the iPad, or I told him to turn off the gaming system, and he erupted. Like it was the most volatile, explosive response. And certainly there's a cognitive component to that as well, with what we know happens for a lot of boys when they engage gaming and watching with technology. But there's an emotional part of that as well. So just learning to regulate and categorize the events of life accurately is what that milestone's about. It is huge. It's so huge. And then the third milestone is the milestone of empathy. And empathy is a well-researched foundational ingredient in all healthy interpersonal relationships. So spouse to spouse, parent to child, coworker to coworker, friend to friend, like empathy is a game changer. And we're reading so much about it. We've researched empathy to death. Like, I don't even know why we keep researching, because we're all in agreement. Like, it's a good and necessary thing. And so I'm just wanting to add to that conversation and confirm it indeed is. And I would then move to the fourth milestone, is the milestone of resourcefulness. And that's learning to take the emotion to something constructive. So it's figuring out what to do with these feelings I have inside, and being reminded that we are all made in the image of God. We're emotional creatures. There is so much evidence throughout Scripture of where Jesus and his humanity felt all these things. Like, think about the encounter that he has with Mary when her brother has died, who's also his dear friend. And she comes to him and says, Lord, if you had been here, he would not have died. And his response, what we're told in Scripture, his response was that he wept. He wept. He expressed empathy in this dear friend over the loss of someone he loved greatly. In fact, the passage beyond that says, the Jews' responses to him was, see how he loved him. Like
Yeah.
they could tell by watching and observing this exchange. And that encounter, I think about the encounter he has with the disciples in the garden when he feels afraid and he says, "Stay
Mm.
awake with me," and they go to sleep. That sense of
Yeah.
betrayal he experiences. I think about his encounter with the tax collectors in the temple when he learns they're using the space in a way that it
Mhm.
was never intended to be used, and we're told he felt anger. Like all these
Mhm.
accounts that remind us he felt all these feelings.
Yes.
We are going to feel all these feelings. And our message consistently throughout the emotional milestones is feelings are not good or bad. Some of
Yeah.
us grew up being told that, like the good
Mhm.
feelings are things like happiness and joy. The
Right.
bad ones are things like sadness and anger. Like, don't feel those. And I'm always quick to say to parents, throw that out if that was
Yeah.
the messaging you got, because it's not true. It's not
Right.
helpful. It's not healthy. And
Mm.
we want to communicate to kids that feelings are just feelings, and we're going to
Yeah.
have a range of them. And for some kids, for some boys, they have big emotions. Like
Mhm.
they feel deeply. And
Yes.
that's a fantastic thing. I tend to
Right.
say to a lot of those boys who are like, "What's wrong with me? I just get so mad or I get so sad." I'm like, "Buddy, there's nothing wrong with you. That's how God hardwired you."
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what I call that. I call that husband material right there. Like your
Mm.
wife
Yeah.
is going to love that on you.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
I even with a lot of young boys will frame it like a superhero power. Like I'll say to
Totally.
them things like, "You have a spidey sense, don't you? Like
Yeah.
you can pick up
So
on things
good.
that are happening before everyone else in the room can, like Spider-Man could." I
I
want
love
them to
it.
understand the strength of it,
Yes.
because I think, again, particularly as they get to that stage 3 space, that 9 to 10 window that we talked about where everything's gonna start
Mhm.
turning, they'll start to feel like it's more of a curse than a blessing.
Mhm.
And so I
Yeah.
want parents to be speaking into the strength of that. And again,
I love that.
if I were to give the Cliff Notes version of all 4 of those milestones, it's we wanna help the kids we love figure out what do I feel and what to do with it. And I think that
Amen.
sounds so simple, but the
Mhm.
statistics would tell us that's just not happening. I mean,
Mhm.
boys lead some of the scariest statistics that are out there. Adolescent
Yes.
boys lead the stats around depression, around self harm, around
Mhm.
suicide, around substance abuse, around internet pornography. And then it goes forward even worse with adult men who lead the stats around infidelity, internet
Mhm.
pornography, substance abuse, suicide, all of these really scary
Yeah.
categories that if you connect the dots, the common denominator with all of those being he could not deal with what he felt. And so he was trying to
Mm.
numb it out in some way,
Yep.
make it stop,
Wow.
shut it down. And so
Wow.
I know I sound like I'm preaching. Forgive me. I just
No,
feel
it's
so
so good.
passionately about this, and I believe so strongly in it. And I think on my watch, I want to do everything in my power that we could raise up a generation of boys who are emotionally and spiritually so much more healthy than what we're seeing in the world right now. And that amazing people like you are
Mm.
writing around this and speaking to this and creating an opportunity for us to have conversation around this in ways that I'm just, again, really thankful to be a part of.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And that's super encouraging to me. And it really makes me think with my 10-year-old son how important it is that I'm tuned into these things now and the emotional vocabulary, especially because as a 10-year-old, he has a teenage brother and 2 young adult brothers. And I see him always trying to keep up with them and trying to be big and act like them. And I see when I heard you talk about, the fact that boys typically turn all their emotions into one, which is anger, it just kind of broke my heart a little because I thought, oh, I don't want to just let this stage pass and have him grow up into the next stage without first figuring out how to handle these emotions and give him those words and that vocabulary. And I actually do mention that in Boy Mom, how when my boys were little, I would try to give them words, are you feeling? And I'd give a couple to choose from because that helped them name their feelings. So I'm glad I did that instinctively. But now that this son is 10, I just see the importance of giving him some vocabulary to work through this stage and through feelings, all the different feelings. Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying this conversation, and there is so much more yet to come. But I want to pause here real quick to thank this episode's sponsor, which is the Good Book Company. Now, I love what the Good Book Company is all about. They create and publish biblical, relevant, and accessible resources that will encourage you and your church family to keep going, keep growing, and keep sharing your faith. Now, I'm especially excited about a book that is absolutely perfect for this holiday season. It is called A Better Than Anything Christmas by Barbara Rioche. And this is available wherever books are sold, but I'll be linking to it in show notes. And I really want you to go to show notes so you can see a picture of this book. It is absolutely beautiful. It's one of those books I just get excited to pull out for the holidays. It is an Advent devotional for the whole family, and there are journaling pages that make it really special. And then if you have more than one child, you can go to thegoodbook.com and get extra journaling pages so everyone can be involved. I think you're going to love it. I think everyone should check it out this Advent season. So be sure to go to show notes and find out more about A Better Than Anything Christmas by Barbara Rioche. And now we'll get back to our interview. Maybe you can now dive into some of the stumbling blocks for us for each of these stages.
Well, I think that sets the stage for what I would say is probably the biggest. And I think it's the cultural messages that boys are going to get throughout their lives in so many different ways, through the books that are written, the movies and television shows that are created. I think even when boys watch adult men in professional sports, like, the messages around all these different contexts is it's okay to be angry. That's fully masculine. It's not okay to be sad. It's not okay to be afraid. And I think we as males, this is one of the stumbling blocks, we crave competence. We really want to look and seem and appear as if we are competent in all things. And my great challenge to dads consistently is talk about when you feel afraid. That I think is so important, to give boys permission to say, men do not have it all figured out. We pretend like we do sometimes, and we do not. And there again, back to that encounter Jesus had with the disciples, he felt afraid.
Yeah.
He felt afraid, and he wanted his friends to be with him in that moment. And so as many times as we can anchor boys to those experiences, I think that's incredibly important. And I think even larger than that, my challenge to so many dads is, boys just need to see that emotions reside in the life of a man. Like, we work so hard to not show evidence of any of what we're experiencing, whether it is fear, sadness, any of those things. And Mike, I remember years ago attending a funeral for a man in the town where I grew up who was just a great man in our community. And his kids were good friends of mine. And I went back home for the funeral, and his grandsons were at the front of the church during this ceremony. And right as they were about to carry his casket out, the family was standing kind of on each side. His youngest grandson, who I think was 6 at the time, started sobbing uncontrollably. And he laid his head on the casket, just like he was trying to give his grandfather one last hug, and was wailing. I mean, it was something that every one of us could feel on the inside of this little boy who loved this man so much. And his 14-year-old grandson was standing and watching this happen and shaking, but fighting, crying. Like he was just fighting tooth and nail not to let a tear roll down his face.
You're making me cry.
I know. And I remember walking out of the church, and several people said to me, like, I feel so worried about that little 6-year-old boy right now. And I remember thinking, I don't feel worried about him at all. Like, he's doing what every one of us who loves this man should be doing, like just weeping and saying, you were so important to me. I miss you. And I'm not even going to try and hold that back.
I love it.
It's full grief that just allows us to honor people that we loved. I said, I'm worried about the 14-year-old boy who's fighting so hard against what's going on inside of him. And so think about that, whatever age. And you're listening and thinking about in this, like, that's what we want to be freeing our sons up to do in as many ways as possible. It's just feel whatever it is that they're feeling in this moment, because boys have a tendency to go inward with that, and then for it to come out sideways, which is why I think it presents in anger so oftentimes.
Yes.
So I would also say, as I speak to that, watch for when you're, and I'm jumping back and forth between building blocks and stumbling blocks as we talk
That's
about
right.
ideas, but I want to give as many ideas as possible to
I
parents
love it.
is, watch for when it happens. If you're watching a show together, if you're watching a movie together on a family night, if you're reading a book, watch for evidence of where he could see either thing on a character. Like,
Mm.
what do you think he's feeling right now that he's trying not to show us? Or what do you think about what he did with all that satisfied? Look for as much evidence as
Ah,
possible where we can
yep.
see it on a screen or in front of us, because I talk a lot about how boys are primarily visual, spatial, and experiential learners. And so
Mhm.
we're going to spend a lot of his life talking at him and talking to him, and not all of that landing on him. And so
Right.
anytime we can use what's in front of us, a visual tool in particular, I think he can make connections around that in some pretty remarkable ways. So
So good.
those would be some of the first stumbling blocks that come to mind as I think around what gets in the way of a lot of boys developing in that direction.
Definitely. Oh, I just can relate to all of that just from my experience raising my boys. I love that. So good for parents to be on the lookout for.
Yes. Can I tell you another that I think is a barrier?
Please,
And you just
please.
stop me anytime, like, enough, David, enough.
No,
Um,
keep going.
I think one of the biggest that won't surprise a single person listening is screens. Just that we're parenting in the age of
Preach.
technology, and
Mm-hmm.
why I think we have got to be so intentional about limiting our kids' exposure. And
Yeah.
obviously, we have our hands on a decent amount of data so far that tells us more about the cognitive effects. And, we now know that over long periods of time, if kids have too much exposure, we could train a brain to be attention deficit. A
Yes.
kid who didn't struggle in that space could begin to, as a result of just spending too much time staring at a screen. And I am every bit as concerned about the cognitive effects, but I am equally concerned about the emotional and social effects too. And
Yes.
in Are My Kids on Track, we included one study that was done out of UCLA where they took a group of sixth graders and gave this entire group a quiz where basically kids weren't doing anything more than looking at faces. They were looking at photographs of people, and they had to identify just by looking at their expression, what's that person feeling? So they gave everybody the quiz. They split the group into two groups, and they said, okay, for this group over here, group A, for the next 5 days, just 5 days, no screens.
Hmm.
For the second group, group B, you keep using screens the normal amount that you would on a given day. Don't change
Mm-hmm.
anything. Don't do more or less. Just use it the same amount. Brought them all back in, gave the exact same quiz again.
Mm-hmm.
And which group do you think scored higher?
Oh, I can only
We all
imagine.
know. But
Yeah.
what's important to note is not a little bit higher, significantly higher
Wow.
after
Yeah.
only 5 days. And I love sharing the findings of that study because I want that to be encouraging for any parent who's sitting here and thinking, oh, we've gone way too long. Like, I love that in only 5 days, just
Yes.
5 days of kids interacting more with human beings, having more conversations, having to read nonverbal cues, that they became that much more attuned to the emotions in others.
Oh, that
You
is
could
so
score higher. I
encouraging.
know, it's
Yes,
deeply encouraging. And
it
so
is.
we can begin to make very small changes and see significant results in a short period of time. So
I love that.
I would lay that
Yes.
out there as it's helpful.
Absolutely. No, that is huge. That is so important. And you see it. You see it in the younger generation when kids can't give you eye contact or they struggle to have conversations because they're so used to texting or messaging all of their
Yes.
conversations. And oh, that's just really important to keep in mind. I love that. Okay, give us maybe one more stumbling block.
Can I give you another?
Please.
All right. Now, I'm going to preface this one by saying, moms who are listening, I want you to fasten your seatbelt for a moment.
Okay.
And I want you to stay with me because what I'm about to say may feel a little bit like a punch to the gut, but I want you to stay with me because there's good news on the other side of this. But one of the stumbling blocks I name is mothers. And I want to talk about what I mean behind that because you're also one of the building blocks. And so it's both sides, but without realizing what can happen sometimes with moms out of this great love you have for the boys in your life. And I want it to be a great love. I'm an advocate of it. I talk about in stage 2 in the lover stage how you are like the center of his universe. You are like the
Mm.
planet that he is orbiting around at all times.
I
You're
love
like
it.
home plate, that base he's running back to. And
Mm.
as I said to you on the front side of our conversation, I'm so thankful you've written so much around that, because there's just so much to say about that
Mhm.
relationship.
Yeah.
Because that relationship is so significant, if we don't pay enough attention to the role we play when he is struggling to regulate his emotions, when he's working through hard emotions, you can end up becoming his resourcefulness. And so we
Oh,
talk
yeah.
about how kids don't develop kids don't
Oh,
develop resourcefulness because we're too busy being the resources. And so
absolutely.
I always want to challenge mom that when boys are struggling and you've offered support and they are not wanting to work anything through on their own, maybe brainstorm some ideas beforehand and they know what to do but are choosing not to. What boys instinctively will do with moms is something that I call anchoring. And
Mm.
it's a little bit like that age old saying. I remember being in elementary school the first time I heard my grandmother say, "Misery loves company." That age old
Mm.
saying that
Oh,
is
yeah.
true for all of us emotionally, that if I feel yucky on the inside, I'd really like to tie an anchor around your waist and drag you to the bottom of the lake
Oh.
with me, and you'd feel yucky with me. And it's what's
S
instinctive for all of us
Yes,
as
yes.
humans. Boys in particular with moms. So if they're struggling, they'd really like to anchor themselves to you, and you
Okay.
just problem solve them right out of it. You
Mm.
become their resources. And so we want them to develop resourcefulness. And so I have
Yes.
a whole roadmap. And
Mm.
I'm so grateful for you encouraging parents to listen, because in the episodes on perspective and resourcefulness, I talk a lot about this idea, how
Mhm.
to create an actual space
Yeah.
where boys can go to work through the struggle so that they're developing that resourcefulness.
Mhm.
And I challenge moms to even see these exchanges a little bit like emotional tug of war. And so if you think about back when you were in elementary school, if you ever had a field day experience and you played tug of
Mhm.
war, the objective is we're going back and forth and trying to pull the other team over. If you stay in emotional tug of war with him long term, it teaches him to always be picking up the rope and pulling you into the exchange. But if
Ooh,
you learn to lay the rope down over time,
wow.
because when one team lays down the rope, the game of tug of
The
war is
It's
over.
over. Yes. Love that.
And we're setting the stage for, him to develop more resourcefulness. And again, there's a lot of brainstorming that goes on in non-problematic times to help
Mhm.
set the stage for this.
Yes.
We're doing a lot
Yes.
of that because in those moments when any one of us, not just boys, but any one of us as human beings are emotionally charged, we talk a lot about how there's blood flow moving throughout the brain, front to back, side to side. And when we're calm, it's evenly distributed,
Yep.
mostly hovering around the frontal lobes, which help us think rationally and manage
Mhm.
our emotions. But
Yep.
when we're emotionally charged, it moves to the back of the brain, to the amygdala, that fight or flight or freeze part of the brain, and we
Mhm.
can't think rationally and manage our
Yep.
emotions well there. And so
Yes.
we do a lot of talking and coaching and lecturing in those moments when boys don't
Can't
have
even hear
blood
you.
flow
Yeah.
around the frontal lobes. Exactly. And so
Yeah.
the brainstorming happens in the calm moments so that we have good plans in action and we have good coping skills we've been thinking around.
Mhm.
Even making a list, kind of back to that visual tool, we've
Mhm.
got a list hanging up in some space where he can remember things that might help him to work through frustrating moments. And
Mm.
then again, setting the stage.
Oh, that is all so good. It makes me think of a time not too long ago where and I hate to pick on my 10-year-old, but he's the youngest, so I'm thinking about him developmentally, but he kind of was hitting a bad moment and the whole family was kind of coming down on him like, "Buddy, you're blowing it." And all the brothers kind of chewed him out, and then dad and mom, and he was just kind of having this little fit that wasn't very familiar to me. And when I asked him, "What are you feeling?" he just kind of grabbed his head. I mean, it's sad for me to remember, but he just said, "I don't even know." And
Mm,
when I've heard you talk or even Sissy talk about this, that's what it makes me think of, is in that moment, he didn't even know what to think. He just
you're
knew that
right.
his brain was shutting down and all
Yes.
the emotions were there. And I love that Sissy too encouraged, we talked about raising anxious kids and just helping him to breathe in that moment. Let's just take some
Yes.
breaths And then when we're outside of that moment, let's talk about what to do when you're
Yes.
overwhelmed, and let's talk about how to walk through this. And I know because I have college boys, and when I wrote Boy Mom, I was really focused on the launch and setting your vision for that launch. When you have a son who's resourceful, the difference it makes when you do get to that day where you're launching them into the world, especially for us across the ocean, independent, and they're going to face some things. Thank God they don't need mom involved in every decision they make. That's the
Absolutely.
goal, is you want to know that they can handle some tricky situations on their own. And so the
Yes.
more you can start that when they're 9 and 10 and 13 and 15, you'll be glad later.
You're so
So,
right. You are so right. Well,
mm,
and something you said and telling that story reminded me I wanted to mention, so often what happens for boys of many ages is that we as males have a lot of physicality to our emotions. So it's why
yeah.
toddler age boys are more prone to biting and hitting and kicking and screaming in preschool classrooms. And it's why adolescent boys are a little more prone to punching holes in drywall sometimes. It's just
Yeah.
this sense that we have this energy that we need to get out. And so
Yes.
I have so many parents who'll say, like, when he's really upset, like he grunts or growls like an animal. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I feel sure he does sometimes.
Right.
And that out, I talked earlier about how boys go inward. We want to be always about the training of helping him go outward, like releasing that
Yes.
intensity and that energy and those emotions outward. And so
Mm,
I'm all for when boys are coming up with their list that they post to have at least 4 of the 5 involving movement of some
yeah.
kind.
Yeah.
And I love hearing boys talk about over the journey of their growing up, figuring out what are the things that really work for them.
Mm,
And so, my twin sons both ended up becoming runners. They run cross
yeah.
country and track, and
Yes.
they figured out that running was this great outlet that then when they're
Yeah.
feeling a lot of stress and worry and anxiety or
Mhm.
anger, frustration over the different events of life,
Mhm.
that running has become this outlet for them, this place to
Yes.
kind of channel some of that intensity. And it's different for every boy, but I
Mhm.
want every boy to be about the practice of figuring out what those things are for them so that when they hit the very moment you describe, when we launch them out to college, send them away, they have
Yep.
a great sense of what it looks like.
Totally. Yeah. My boys, that's, I think, what surfing has been for them when they grew up surfing when they were
Yes.
young. But when they hit their teenage years, surfing started playing a different role. And I think that's what it was. I think it was just the place they went that allowed them to get that stuff out and to experience just a real peace. And I mean, not only is exercise healthy physically, but yeah,
Yes.
emotionally so good. I love each of these so much. And I really wish we could just do an entire episode on each of these. I love the perspective so much that you talked
Mhm.
about, just the scale of 1 to 10. My husband's a doctor, and so he's got every time something's wrong with one of us, he's like, scale of 1 to 10. I'm like, really? But
Yes.
it's so helpful.
It is so helpful
And I
because that
agree
very
with you.
example you shared, it's like,
Yeah.
if I can't tell my doctor in the ER where my pain is, he can't treat it appropriately.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
we need to be able to name it accurately. I love that.
Yes, but and it's so true with kids that to help them go, this isn't a 10, this is actually
Yes.
a 3, and we can work through it. So then
Yes.
to get that resourcefulness where you teach them what to do when they're struggling, how to self-soothe, how to rationalize. Oh, this is all so good. So we're going to make sure that people are able to listen to your episodes where you go further into this, as well as read your book, Are My Kids on Track? That's the best book for talking about these emotional milestones. Is that right?
That is correct. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, we are going to have another episode where we talk about social milestones. And so I think we'll wrap up for now and have you back on. I am so thankful for your time and I am so inspired by everything you talk about. So I just want to thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Well, we'll have a fun next chat and hopefully more in the future after that. So until next time, we'll say goodbye. Aloha. Okay, friends, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know I was so inspired and encouraged by everything that David Thomas had to say, and I can't wait to have him back in 2 more weeks. So, thank you again for being a part of this community. If you have not left a rating or review yet, I would love it if you would. You can just go right on your smartphone, scroll down to the bottom of this podcast, find those 5 stars, tap on them. And if you want to leave a few words about what you love most about the Boy Mom podcast, that would mean a lot to me as well. And thanks just for sharing the word about this podcast with your friends. This community is growing every week, and I am so encouraged. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And until next time, aloha.